today's video, we're going to take a look at some people who seem to look the Grim Reaper directly in the eye and tell him to get lost. Our first story comes from one of the most dangerous times to be alive in human history, World War II. For the first half of the conflict, the United States was trying its best to stay neutral, only sending weapons and supplies to its allies in Europe. But when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1942, war was officially declared on the Axis powers, and thousands of young men rushed to enlist in the various branches of the American military. One of these young men was Alan Eugene McGee, and after joining the United States Air Force, he was assigned to the mighty B-17 bomber. B-17s were high-priority targets for German fighters, and as such had an incredibly high death rate. It's estimated that at best a B-17 crew had a 50-50 chance of survival throughout the war, and a good chance of becoming a prisoner of war if they happened to survive a crash landing. The cabin of a B-17 wasn't pressurized either, so the crew had to endure unbelievably low temperatures and wear oxygen masks as well. So the odds already looked a bit bleak for the young Alan. But it gets worse, he wasn't a pilot, so had been assigned to man the ball turret. The ball turret was one of the worst places to be. Jutting out from the bottom of the aircraft and with no way to be retracted, the ball turret was essentially a metal and glass sphere with a machine gun poking out of it. This gave the gunner a wide field of view to help defend the bomber from enemy fighter planes, but the turret itself was pretty exposed and was an easy target. During Alan's 7th mission, a daytime bombing raid over France in January 1943, German flak struck his turret, rendering it useless. After climbing out of the ball and back up to the main cabin, Alan was relieved to see that the flak hadn't seriously wounded him, but then he noticed that it had completely shredded up his parachute. While moving to the plane's radio room, the bomber was struck again, this time tearing off a chunk of the right wing and sending the airplane into a spiral. During the spiral, Alan blacked out, probably as a result of his oxygen supply getting ruptured. And somehow, while the plane was tumbling out of the sky, Alan's unconscious body was thrown clear of it and sent rocketing towards the ground. With nothing to slow his fall, Alan fell a mind-boggling 22,000 feet, that's 6,700 meters at terminal velocity, and smashed through the glass roof of the St. Nazaire railroad station. Miraculously, he survived the fall, possibly because smashing through the glass roof had slowed his fall just enough before hitting the ground. He had several broken bones, a smashed nose, lung damage, his right arm was nearly tore off during the crash landing, and shrapnel and glass wounds covered his body, but he was in stable condition. He was immediately taken prisoner by the Germans who treated his wounds, and he was eventually released at the end of the war. Alan received the Purple Heart, the Air Medal, and in 1993 a statue dedicated to his crew in St. Nazaire. You might think that he'd never want to set foot on a flying machine ever again, but Alan actually earned his pilot's license after the war and worked in the airline industry until he died at the age of 84. One crucial part of Alan's survival is the fact that he received medical care so quickly after his fall, but our next person wouldn't quite be so lucky. Julian Kupka was born in Peru in 1954. The parents were published German biologists who were in Peru for research in their field, and Julian grew up and attended a German international school in Lima. On Christmas Eve 1971, Julianne, accompanied by her mother, booked a flight from Lima to Pucallpa to visit her father, who was working on a biological conservation center across the country. Her mother wanted to fly a few days earlier, but Julianne didn't want to miss her high school graduation ceremony, so they agreed on Christmas Eve. Because of the busy Christmas season, though, every flight was sold out except for 2 seats on Líneas Aéreas Nacionales, also known as Lancer. Julianne's father tried to persuade his wife and daughter to wait until after Christmas so they could book a different flight because Lancer apparently had a terrible reputation as an airline, but Julianne and her mother didn't want to miss Christmas with him and they boarded the plane anyway. As it was reaching its cruising altitude halfway to the destination, the plane was shaking with extreme turbulence as it flew through a storm. Suddenly, lightning struck the side of the plane. Most passenger jets are designed to withstand a lightning strike, but this one had hit one of the plane's engines, which was now on fire, causing the pilot to lose control. Julianne later told the BBC, "The plane jumped down and went into a nosedive. It was pitch black and people were screaming. Then the deep roaring of the engines filled my head completely. But suddenly, the noise stopped. While the plane was plummeting, the fuselage was being torn apart, and Julianne's row of 3 seats was sucked out into the sky. She was now free-falling, strapped to a window seat as her mother and a stranger on her left were thrown from theirs. The seats began spinning wildly as they fell, and Julianne lost consciousness. After slipping in and out of consciousness for over a day, she finally sat up. She was still too dizzy to walk and had fractured shin, a broken collarbone, and a torn ACL. She was the only survivor. She probably survived thanks to the large row of seats somewhat slowing her fall, as well as plunging through several meters of tree branches and leaves before hitting the ground. But now she faced her next problem. Unlike Alan, who fell into a train station, Julianne was now alone in the middle of the Peruvian Amazon. But strangely enough, at just age 17, Julianne already had the knowledge to handle this unique situation. She had spent a year and a half with her biologist parents in Peru and was familiar with the wildlife of the jungle. Her father had given her advice if she ever got lost in the jungle, which was to find and follow a river. She found a bag of candy in the crash site, which would be her only food for another 9 days, and she set off to look for help. When moving through the jungle, any step could be your last. The Amazon is home to lethal snakes, caimans, poison frogs, and an endless number of pesky insects, so she had to be extra careful, which was difficult because she lost her glasses in the crash. Moving slowly along the edges of a creek, she would throw her sandal on the ground to scare away any snakes, but eventually she began walking in the water. Walking in the shallow edge of the river was quicker than on land, especially because the water felt much better on her feet than the branches and rocks. But the water brought its own dangers, and Julianne remarked that she shared the river with caiman on several occasions, but she paid them no mind, as she was aware that they rarely attacked humans unless provoked. While she was making her way along the river, she would hear planes buzzing in the sky overhead, likely looking for the downed passenger jet, but Julianne knew that there was no hope of getting their attention from where she was, and the situation was getting worse. She hadn't eaten in several days now, and a fly had laid eggs in a cut on her arm, which was now starting to swell with maggots. Eventually, she collapsed from exhaustion at the side of the river. When she woke up, something immediately grabbed her attention. A boat. This was the first man-made object she'd seen in over a week, and it meant the possibility of nearby help. She crawled to the boat and then noticed an empty hut near it. Next to the hut was a barrel of gasoline, and Julianne cleverly siphoned some of it off and poured it on her infected arm, which brought the maggots to the surface so she could pick them out. It was incredibly painful, but she knew it was either that or lose her arm. After trying and failing to catch some frogs, she fell asleep in the hut, now almost 10 days without food. But fortunately, this was her last night before rescue. In the morning, 3 lumber workers returned to the hut to find Julianne, who they initially mistook to be a water spirit. Then, after feeding her and treating her wounds, they took her in their boat to the nearest city, where she gave law enforcement directions to the crash site and made it to her father. Julianne went on to marry her parents' footsteps, getting a doctoral degree. Overall, Julianne's story is not only one of extreme luck, but also one of determination and quick thinking. Our next story takes us to Croatia, where a man named Franco Selak was born in 1929. There's been some intense exaggeration of Selak's life on the internet, of course, and there are skeptics that doubt the authenticity of his stories, but we're going to go over what is generally accepted as the 7 separate times that he cheated death. Everything started in 1962, when Selak was riding a train that derailed and fell into an icy river. 17 of the passengers on the train drowned, but Selak was pulled to safety and only suffered a broken arm and hypothermia. In 1963, on his first ever plane ride, a malfunctioning door broke open next to him during an emergency landing, and he fell from the plane onto a haystack, which broke his fall. 3 years later, in 1966, Selak was riding on a bus when the driver, who had a few drinks before getting behind the wheel, lost control, and the bus skidded into a river, which Selak managed to escape from with only minor cuts and bruises. Now, at this point, you might expect him to stop taking public transport, but he ran into his own problems even after buying his car. In 1973, Selak was driving when a malfunctioning fuel pump spewed hot oil all over his engine, which ignited and started spitting flames through the air vents, but he was able to pull over and get out of the car before suffering any more than singed hair and minor burns. The next year, he was hit by a bus while crossing the road, but it was moving quite slowly, and he didn't suffer any serious injuries. Finally, his 7th escape from the Grim Reaper came in 1996 when, in an effort to avoid a head-on collision with a truck, he swerved his vehicle into a guardrail on the side of the road, and because he wasn't wearing his seatbelt, he was ejected from the vehicle, yet somehow he survived. And somehow, at this point in his life, he was still not wearing a seatbelt. But his story isn't over just yet. Just after his 73rd birthday in 2003, Selak, who spent much of his adult life as a music teacher, won the lottery and received 6.5 million kuna, which is about 900,000 euros. He bought himself 2 homes, several cars, and shared the money with his family and friends. His fitting nickname after all of this is the luckiest unlucky man on earth. A lot of survival stories have received criticism because they've been hard to independently verify, and Selak has been accused of either fabricating or exaggerating his own stories to make them seem more dangerous. After all, it seems unlikely that one man would survive a crash from a plane, train, bus, and a car. It seems the only vehicle that he hasn't had a near fatal accident with was a boat, which is ironic because he was born on one. Selak has been interviewed by the BBC, The Guardian, and countless times by Croatian media, and was always adamant that his story was the truth until his death in 2016 at the age of 87. The last person on our list might be the luckiest of them all. So far, we've covered close calls with falling from an airplane, surviving without food in the Amazon, and a train crash into an icy river, but these incidents are arguably nothing compared to the explosion of an atomic bomb. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was an engineer working for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries during the Second World War, a war which he believed Japan had no business getting involved in. His view of his country's situation was getting more and more disheartened every day as Japanese ships were sunk, resources were becoming scarce, and the economy was beginning to suffer. On August 6, 1945, Yamaguchi was sent by his boss to Hiroshima for a business meeting. At 8:15 a.m., he was walking toward the city's docks when the first atomic bomb was dropped. He recalled seeing the airplane in the sky, the parachute holding the bomb, and then a blinding light. The bomb went off just 3 kilometers from where he was standing, but he survived. His eardrums were ruptured, his vision was distorted, and he had radiation burns on the upper half of his body. After recovering for a brief moment, he located his colleagues to make sure that they were all right, and after spending the night in an air raid shelter, he hopped on the first train back to his hometown, Nagasaki.
Oh no.
Yamaguchi showed up for work in Nagasaki on the 9th of August and was trying to explain what had happened to his boss, who simply couldn't believe that one bomb had destroyed the whole city. Just then, the second atomic bomb was dropped, once again just 3 kilometers from where he stood. This time around, he wasn't visibly injured from the blast, but the radiation had ruined his bandages and made him extremely sick, causing him to continuously vomit for over a week. Despite being near ground zero for 2 atomic bombs, Yamaguchi went on to lead a relatively healthy life. He had to wear bandages constantly for several years after the war, and he permanently lost hearing in his left ear. Yamaguchi returned to work at Mitsubishi and later became an advocate for nuclear disarmament, using his own shocking tales to convey the horrors of atomic weapons. And in 2009, he became the only person to be officially recognized by the Japanese government as a survivor of both atomic bombs. Tsutomu Yamaguchi died in 2010 at the age of 93, having walked away from 2 of the most catastrophic events in human history.